Hey guys, Shuttle here. Today I'm going to go through the basics of the French Revolution, just kind of going through the major highlights, the different phases, the key people that we have to know. I put stuff in bold that was the most important if that helps you in taking down notes as I go. I'm going to go pretty fast for the sake of time, but also just that way we can get through everything. Feel free to pause the video or slow it down if that helps you out at all. I also linked these actual slides. This slideshow is on the period 2 section of Canvas if you want to check it out there. So let's get started. Basic overview of the French Revolution. I know you have learned it in previous class periods over the years or previous classes over the years. I kind of want to go through the major phases of it that you may not have learned before. And I'm going to dive into the causes here in a second. There's 4 main phases to the French Revolution. The first phase is the moderate phase. Second phase is the radical phase. Third is conservative phase, and then the fourth one is Napoleonic phase. Today, I'm only going to focus on the first 3 because we're going to talk about Napoleon at a later date. So we're going to kind of focus on just those first 3. So let's talk about what caused the French Revolution. French Revolution had a wide variety of different causes, and you can kind of argue it almost became the perfect storm in 1789 for France. Really, the France as we had known it under the reigns of Louis XIII, Louis XIV, or even earlier, no longer really existed. Yes, it was an absolute monarchy, but there was so much other turmoil going on as a whole in the country. It really was the perfect storm. You've got Enlightenment ideas, massive debt between the reigns of Louis XIV and the XV. We've got those loss of wars, the colonies in the 7 Years' War. Of course, the French helped out the Americans during their wars of revolution. That cost a lot of money. Then you also have the kind of system in place that was in France for many hundred years known as the Ancien Regime, also known as the Old Regime or Ancient Regime. It was basically the way that taxes would work in France. Essentially, the church and nobility, the upper echelon of society, smallest percentage of the population, were completely exempt from taxation. The common people, who of course made up the bulk of the population, had to pay all the taxes in France. Obviously not equitable, definitely did not go over very well. So because of this giant storm of stuff going on in France from all these things, Louis XVI, and of course, his queen Marie Antoinette eventually called the Estates General. Now, I will talk about Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette a bit more in class. Keep in mind, they are not very popular with the French people. Their marriage is a total cluster, and we will talk about it in class because it is fascinating and a hot mess. We'll come back to them. All right, 1789. Louis XVI calls the Estates General, which was the kind of ancient assembly that had been around in France going all the way back to the Middle Ages. The first estate was made up of the Catholic clergy. Second estate was the nobility. The third estate was the commoners, which was the vast majority of the population. And you had these 3 estates that were, in essence, supposed to work together, but unfortunately they didn't. In fact, the Estates General was pretty ineffective. Each estate only had 1 vote, and the third estate was constantly being told that they were less important and weren't enough. So as a result of that, Third Estate literally straight up walks out. May 5th, 1789, the Third Estate leaves and calls itself the National Assembly and declares itself the official representative government of France. By June, they show up at Versailles to take part of the Estates General, but they are locked out. So they decide to meet at an indoor tennis court, and this becomes known as the Tennis Court Oath, which is where they all swore not to disperse before making a new constitution, and this kind of marks the unofficial beginning of the French Revolution. There were some members of the clergy and nobility who joined the cause because they felt strongly about the cause for the Third Estate. Publicly, Louis XVI did support it, but because really he didn't have much of a choice, but low-key, he is not down with it at all. So here's where we start phase 1, known as our moderate phase. I like to think of phase 1 as kind of the more chill and frankly, I think the most rational of all the phases. You could argue that the rest of them, of course, get a little out of control. And I also feel like if Louis XVI had just gotten on board here, it would have been fine, but I digress. So Phase one instituted a lot of liberal reforms. They established a constitutional monarchy in France, so they tried to work things out with Louis XVI, increase popular participation, nationalize the Catholic Church, and abolish those ancient hereditary privileges that had been in France for a long time. Really, what kind of starts this off and what we know is kind of the official start of the revolution was July 14th, 1789, also known as Bastille Day, which is today France's Independence Day. A group of rebels stormed the Bastille prison in France, as you can kind of see in this image here. Low-key, there are only 7 inmates, so how much of a big deal it really was for breaking out all these people out of prison, meh. But the Bastille was the symbol of like ancient old-style monarchy and repression, and so really storming the Bastille was more symbolic than it really was practical. And after this, it's kind of seen as like, oh crap, this is a big deal. So a lot of nobles began to flee the country, including Louis XVI's own younger brothers, who literally bounced to Italy, and this becomes known as the Great Fear. National Assembly, of course, issues the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which is a play on our Declaration of Independence. They're very similar. Basic tenets include equality, free speech, representative government, and popular sovereignty. Now I'm going to add an asterisk there. Remember, it was not all those things for all people. Primarily landowning white men are going to be who kind of get those rights. Civil constitution of the clergy, the National Assembly decided, you know what, we are going to reduce the power of the Catholic Church. And this civil constitution basically brought the church under complete authority of the state. It basically swore that all French clergy had to owe allegiance to France, not the Pope. Bishops and priests were even elected by the people, and it would sell off church government or church property as a way to make money for the massive debt of the government. Then the French write a brand new constitution. So the Constitution of 1791, contrary to popular belief, does not completely remove Louis from power. In fact, all it did is it established a constitutional monarchy that kind of put the actual lawmaking power in the legislative assembly. The problem is, though, is this was a little bit of kind of wishful thinking. Most French people really didn't have a lot of trust in Louis and Marie, so it was kind of doomed from the start. And though Louis technically signed on, he was low-key sending letters and asking for help from his brother-in-law, Leopold II, in the hope that this wouldn't actually end up becoming a thing, the constitutional monarchy. The other thing the National Assembly did that we have to know is they abolished the ancient provinces that had been in place for hundreds of years in France, and the country was divided into départements. And that's important because basically it divided the country based on geographical features, not really historical loyalties. France used to be divided by noble families and rich families. And fun fact, these are still the regions of France that continue to exist today. All right, so here is where we make the transition from our moderate phase into, phase into the radical phase. Basically, Louis and fam make a really poor decision. They attempt to flee France, which is seen as kind of a rebuke to the Constitution of 1791, and a way it's almost seen as kind of like a middle finger to the French government and the revolutionaries. It does not go over very well. They make it all the way to the border city of Varennes, and their kind of journey there is known as the Flight to Varennes. They are found out. They are taken to Paris. Found out, and not a shocking twist, that Louis had been writing all kinds of letters denouncing the revolution. So as a result of this, the National Assembly actually declares war on Prussia and Austria, and Louis and family are now political prisoners. Whereas before, the revolutionaries were trying to work with Louis. Now it's all downhill for the royal family, which leads us into phase 2, the radical phase. So basically the radical phase, the big group of people to know here are the Jacobins, and the Jacobins are the radical party of the National Assembly. They take over control of the National Assembly and they rename it the National Convention. And then all heck breaks loose that we're fixing to get into. Couple of guys we have to know. Robespierre, we'll dive way more into in class. Basic things we have to know about him is he is a super gifted speaker. He's actually a passionate supporter of suffrage and abolitionism, fun fact. Ironically, he has executed himself by guillotine. Jean-Paul Marat, he's not really as much of of a political leader as he is a journalist. And a lot of his papers that were very fiercely written were kind of read and spread and kind of would spread those revolutionary ideals. Fun fact, he is murdered in a bathtub by a woman named Charlotte Corday that we will talk about later. Georges Danton headed the Committee of Public Safety with Robespierre. He's also executed by Robespierre. Of course, at this point, Louis and Marie are prisoners. They're quote unquote put on trial, but it's really a total sham. Even Marie is accused of incest with her son, who's like 5. Ridiculous. They're both executed in 1793, about 10 months apart. And the rest of Europe is actually pretty horrified by this. This does not go down well with the rest of Europe, especially England, who sees this as super distasteful. So this starts the Reign of Terror, of course, as we know very, very well, the guillotines and the public executions. It's basically this 10-month time frame where Jacobin would basically target anybody who were quote-unquote opponents of the revolution. Totals, we don't have entirely. The basic estimates were at least 50,000 people are executed in this 10-month time span alone. All right, we've got the Committee of Public Safety. Basically what happened is this was Robespierre and Danton's little group of homies that controlled the National Convention. It was like a little mini dictatorship, if you will. They suspend the Constitution of 1791. They feel that it is their job to defend France against foreign attacks and domestic rebellions. And naturally, because they get a little cray-cray, not a lot of people see a lot of faith in the Committee of Public Safety, and it goes all downhill from there. They start to be seen as a dictatorship. Robespierre even turns on his own committee members. He has Danton executed by guillotine. And then in a big twist of fate, the others then execute Robespierre by guillotine, which is ironic. And the other part of this that we'll talk about, and that's why I have this on here, he does attempt to commit suicide before guillotine. He misses, though, and only shoots off his own jaw. Google it, it's fascinating. All right, the other thing that these Jacobins do is they go on this real crazy de-Christianization policy. They wanted all new religious order based on Enlightenment, secular ideas, not faith. They do a lot of crazy stuff. Notre Dame becomes the temple of reason. Also, if you want to do some fun math, they make a calendar where each year has 12 months of 3 10-day weeks. And then every other day are festival days. So do that math, it's nuts. All right, the other thing that we gotta know, the army is actually kind of seen as the success out of this time frame of the radical phase. The levée en masse, which is basically the military draft of France, rose the army by 1 million by 1794. And we kind of see the army is responsible for preserving the revolution and spreading its ideals around Europe. Women did enthusiastically participate in the revolution. Of course, they don't really get any political leadership as a result of this. Major female events were the October March on Versailles, where 7,000 women marched on Versailles to bring King Louis and Marie Antoinette to Paris. Olympe de Gouges, of course, we learned about in our Enlightenment circle, so I'm going to skip her. And then the Society of Republican Revolutionary Women was a group of working class women who vowed to fight for the Republic, but they're disbanded during the Reign of Terror because Robespierre feels them as a threat. Whatever. That leads us into phase 3. The conservative phase, really, we kind of count as starting with the execution of Robespierre. So we count the Reign of Terror ending when Robespierre is executed, which is kind of known as the Thermidorian reaction, and more moderates rise to power to create a new constitution. This establishes a bicameral legislature. And instead of an executive branch, it creates a 5-member committee instead of like a president, and that's known as the Directory. Problem is, this only lasts 4 years because of our homeboy, Napoleon will roll in and take over everybody. Major effects of the French Revolution we got to know. Haitian Revolution, of course, we learned about. Remember, Haiti at this time was a French colony. Ironically, when the Haitians attempt to have their own revolution, the French, including Robespierre, are like, no. Whatever. They become an independent nation by 1804. And keep in mind that not everybody's down with the revolution's ideals, especially a lot of other people in Europe. Edmund Burke was a very vocal opponent against the violence of the French, especially the English were very anti. They thought the violence was very distasteful. A lot of French nobility escaped there during the revolution. So not everybody's down with its ideals. All right, that's all I got. We'll talk about Napoleon at a later date.